Tonight to have a number of distinguished guests with us that are going to be sharing some of their reflections of the times in which we live. Among them is a talk show host that some of you may have heard of. His name is Phil Donahue. He stopped in today. We also have a very brave young man by the name of Camilo Mejia. Don't know, Camilo is enjoying his first few weeks in what Phil Berrigan used to call minimum security, i.e. he's no longer in prison. Camilo Mejia served 9 months in prison for refusing to kill or be killed in Iraq. I think that it's very important that we remember those of us that are journalists, media workers, people who are about independent media, to remember how much of a threat independent journalists face around the world today. This was one of the bloodiest years, 2004 was one of the bloodiest years ever for our profession. In Iraq alone, the United States military killed more than a dozen journalists, with a deafening silence on the part of their colleagues from the corporate media. And I think we need to remember that those journalists died so that we could understand something about the nature of this occupation. Their lives were not given in vain. And the way that we honor them is by continuing with their mission. We recently have been following the case of the Italian journalist Juliana Segrenna, who's a writer for the newspaper Il Manifesto. She was held hostage by an Iraqi resistance group for a month, and then was released. And as the car that was taking her to the airport, after she was picked up from the abandoned vehicle where she was left by her captors, as that car was going to the airport, it was shot up with hundreds of bullets by a Humvee. And originally what was said about that story is that the Italians refused to slow down at a checkpoint. And so the U.S. soldiers fired in self-defense. Well, now we learn from Juliana Segrenna that in fact there was no U.S. checkpoint, and that she was not on that road, that dangerous road that everyone was talking about. In fact, she was on a road that dates back to the era of Saddam Hussein, that he had established for safe transport between his palace, which is now occupied by the United States, and the Baghdad airport. It was a road that they had to pass checkpoints of the U.S. soldiers to get onto in the first place. It's a road reserved for foreign embassy officials, U.S. military officials, and U.S. officials who are visiting or working within the country. And we're going to continue to talk about that story on Democracy Now!, but I have one question that I want all of us to think about. We know about the case of Juliana Segrenna because she's Italian, and because Italy's #2 military intelligence official was killed in that attack. He was the #2 man in Italy's intelligence service. And he was killed as he tried to shield her, and he saved her life. And if the United States treats Italy in the way that it's treated Italy, and saying that there was no wrongdoing, it was an accident, and if the United States refuses to hold accountable those who did the killing, if the United States refuses to do an adequate investigation, if they refuse to allow the Italians to investigate the car, which indicates they have something to hide, what does that say about the treatment that ordinary Iraqis receive on a daily basis from the U.S. military? Their deaths go uncounted, their injuries go uncounted, at numerous checkpoints around the country where they did or did not slow down, when they heard someone commanding them to do so in a language not their own and not of the country that they live in at that moment in Iraq. Countless Iraqis have been killed at checkpoints. But the media is too busy reporting on Michael Jackson to talk about any of the more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians who have been killed. There are important issues the case of Terry Shiloh. But there are important issues surrounding the case of numerous Iraqis who are being killed on a regular basis, and I wish that we had the drumbeat, non-stop, around-the-clock coverage for the tens of thousands of Iraqis who have been killed that they have devoted to this one thing. I also want to do something that this person is probably going to object to, but I can't not do it. I first went to Iraq in 1998 as a young reporter, and I had the pleasure of meeting someone who became I consider him to be my best friend in Iraq. And he just arrived in the United States tonight, and his name is Abdul Sattar Jihad Jabbar. But we are here to celebrate. And we're here to celebrate another anniversary, and that's the 50th anniversary of our first speaker, and that is Phil Donahue. 50 years ago this year, he went on the air as a journalist. And I could tell you the story of his more than a quarter of a century on the Donahue show. And I could tell you the story of his being fired by MSNBC for allowing anti-war voices on the air. And I could tell you about the internal memo that said that MSNBC did not want to be the face of the anti-war movement. But I'm going to let Phil Donahue talk to you about that himself. So please join me in welcoming Phil Donahue.
I feel among friends, and it's quite an unusual feeling for me. I was wondering if I'd be recognized, and sure enough, a guy out in the lobby said, "Hey, Merv!" My wife and I are children of the 50s. I was raised all Catholic, wall-to-wall Catholic. A girl was a bad thought in my adolescence. And about that time, Marlo makes the point that her parents would say if they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. And that, my folks said, this was the 50s. Eisenhower, America, all good in all things, the good war, Lend-Lease, the Marshall Plan, America. And I, by accident of birth, was a part of this nation. And patriotism was an obvious follow-on to this wonderful nation that did so much to defeat fascism and to put down and respond to the aggression of the Japanese. And so I marched into life very proud and very patriotic. And it wasn't long afterward that I met Noam Chomsky. I said, "What are you trying to say?" And he looked at me and he said, "Never, ever trust the state." Now, it's very important to appreciate what an emotional notion this was for all of us who grew up to salute the flag and sing our songs and believe that our country was all good in all things. We were prepared in our childhood for a world that never materialized. I came very late, and I can't be surprised after this after being raised this way. Ohio State professor came on my program very early on. By the way, we knew we had to be different because we were so visually boring. We had no band, folding chairs. We inherited an audience from the game show, or the host played the piano and you got to wave in the show and you won prizes. That's the show we replaced. So they had the audience. So the audience was there for me when I arrived. We didn't think we needed it. Our first guest was Madeline Murray O'Hare. We knew we had to make noise. And sure enough, in Dayton, Ohio, a local show comes down from Texas, Madeline Murray O'Hare. There's no God, there's no heaven, there's no angels. When you die, you go in the ground, the worms eat you, you biodegrade, and become part of the physical universe. Well, my dear, the roof fell in Dayton, Ohio. No one had ever... You can worship a pet rock if you want to, but you pay for it. I'm tired of paying higher taxes because your churches get all these phony tax breaks. I mean, the woman was sensational. And also very, very unpleasant. But she drew a crowd, and everybody in Dayton knew that there was a talk show on the air that had no band, no desk, no couch, no celebrities. We were in Dayton, Ohio. We couldn't get. I mean, people would say, yes, Dayton, the soapbox derby. And I'd say, no, that's Akron. Don't go to Akron. And we realized early on that we were providing, we had to do a show. We put OGBYN and OBGYN, pardon me. And I'd sit, the phones would just explode. And I'd be sitting there while women called. The phones were jammed, talking about an itch. And then more phone calls. And then the pill and water retention and blurred vision. The pill, this was 1967. And we suddenly realized we had a program that was speaking to the issues about which women cared that nobody else was. We had to do a program titled Doctors Who Hate Donahue. We talked about patronizing doctors who patted you on the head and said it was in your head and sent you off with a piece of paper with scribble on it that you couldn't read for pills that you didn't know anything about. We were very, very proud at that time of our lives to be kicking some very big tires. And we were drawing a very large crowd because we had accidentally discovered that women, that made up most of our audience, had been reading more sections of the newspaper than their husbands, who cared about more than just covered dishes and needlepoint. And this was still a very, very sexist society. And feminists were coming on to talk to our audience about women who have children who get too much mother and not enough father. I remember feeling very, very uncomfortable. And it was along this time that I began to realize that I did not expect America to lose a war. And I can remember an Ohio State professor came in who knew a lot about cars and did research. And I said, what's the best car? This is 1968 or 9. What's the best car? He said, a Honda Accord. I said, a Honda what? The Japanese were taking over automotive supremacy from Detroit. These are things that never occurred to the child of the 50s who believed that if they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. And all of a sudden, the women's movement was exploding. The cities were erupting. It was our first full year was 1968. The cops beat up the kids in Chicago. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The things were coming right then. I had a television show with my name on it, and we were featuring all kinds of people who were dissenting. And yes, we were having... And we were getting away with it. We had a huge audience. We had women out there who wanted this all the while and nobody else gave it to them. And yes, we did have sponsors cancel. Bob Evans of Bob Evans Farm Sausage, I'll never forget it for life. I will not sponsor any programs that tear down America. pretty simple with Bob. I will not sponsor any programs that tear down America. And that was, we had a guy on who said all automobile dealers are crooks, and there went the entire Miami Valley Automobile Dealers Association. Not only off Donahue, but off the whole station. I had salesmen, young guys, 30-something guys whose wives were pregnant, outside my office, and most salesmen at that time were men, by the way, different today. We're slow learners. Wanting to know, what the hell am I doing? You know, and to give a speech to a guy about the First Amendment, to a guy who just lost Rogers Pontiac, rings hollow. And nevertheless, we had a general manager that hung with us. It should be said we had a tremendous audience, too. We did have, well, it's amazing what you can get away with as long as you draw a crowd. And we were, and we had power. And we had anti-war people on. We had a mother whose daughter, who happened to be a Quaker. We were right near Yellow Springs, a state in Ohio. We had a mother whose daughter was, by the way, Louis Gegner's barbershop. Louis Gegner wouldn't cut Negro hair. He didn't know how. He didn't teach me how to cut kinky hair. And every student at Antioch College sat down in the street in front of Louis Gegner's barbershop. And every black kid from Antioch College got in there. He finally succumbed. And he cut Negro hair, and he proved that he didn't know how the hell to cut Negro hair. And we had young black males at Antioch College wearing this thing that looked like he ran into a buzzsaw as a symbol of pride. By the way, one of the students in that sit-down protest was a young co-ed by the name of Coretta Scott. Who was married the moral leader of the modern civil rights movement. And here is the Notre Dame graduate of the class of '57 who thought that girls were a bad thought and that America was right and good in all things, and suddenly the scales were falling from my eyes. The dream of America as I thought it was, the Norman Rockwell world in which I was raised, prepared me not for what was happening in the late 60s and on into the 70s. Nobody told us they'd impeach a president. Nobody told us they would assassinate a president. And we kept on keeping on, and the program began to grow, and suddenly we really felt that we were able to kick some mighty big tires and get away with it. And it's against that backdrop that I appear before you today, out of work, very naively thinking that I was going to be the person whose name was on a program that allowed for a free exercise of First Amendment right of speech, that I was going to be the person who was going to be able to take advantage of the bravery of those young men and women who died on foreign battlefields to protect and promote America's way of life, at the center of which is free speech. Not to exercise it now, of all times, is to waste their blood, I argue. Why did we send it in the first place? Don't waste this young talent if you're not going to take advantage of the way of life that they preserved for us. No, that apparently, and by the way, much too late, that I was always bewildered. How could you put 120,000 Japanese Americans behind a fence? I remember being, what? I remember being bewildered by that. I'm not bewildered anymore. It is amazing what you can do if you frighten the populace. It is amazing. And now, these people who want to promote freedom around the world are putting people in cages, no lawyer, no records, no phone calls, no visitation, no nothing. Now they can, I thought a woman's home was her castle. I'm the Republican. I believe in the Bill of Rights. You now can be searched in your home while you're not there. They can go through your bedroom furniture, and if they don't muss it up too much, they will leave, and you won't even know they were there. They have given themselves the right to do this. This is the same nation that is sending how many? 135,000 of our best and brightest young people, most talented, into Iraq. Marlo and I have visited with a young man who was in Sadr City in April of last year in an open 5-ton truck. He got shot. He is paralyzed from the waist down. He's 24 years old. He's paralyzed from the waist down. And all that means to a young male with a girlfriend who loves him, who will never ever know the totality of his rightful inheritance as a male human being. Unless, of course, we have some wonderful breakthroughs with stem cell research, except the man that sent him to war, where he lost all his feeling and abilities from the waist down, does not approve of stem cell research. This is just one example. I've been to Walter Reed. I've seen the stumps. I've seen them smoking outside of the building. They can't strike a match because you have to have 2 arms and 2 hands to do that. And we still don't know the totality of the mental damage that's been inflicted upon our people. And by the way, this was done without having any respect at all for the framers who said you can't, I'm preaching to the choir, but I got to get this out because I know I'm speaking for you. The Constitution says only Congress can declare war. I'm the conservative. I want us to obey the framers. The framers were right. Bob Byrd said it's wrong. It's wrong. He was right. This is an American. These are red state people who give awards to young people, who offer essays to Daughters of the American Revolution dinners, Chamber of Commerce dinners, American Legion dinners, why I'm proud to be an American, what the Constitution means to me. The framers are our apostles. The Constitution is our patriotic Bible, in every sense, in every word, except the part about going to war. The Congress, you can't expect 535 people to make a good decision. But let's give it to a man. Let's give it to the man. Free speech. Free speech, rights of privacy have become a quaint idea. It's a nice idea, but not now. And America, significant millions of Americans are standing mute while I think the most wonderful document in the history of civilization is totally ignored, if not trashed. Certainly has had its back. Certainly this administration has turned its back to the United States Constitution, and apparently we have far too many people in this nation who don't care. And media is on its way to say, rah, rah, approve. If you dissent before the war, you're not patriotic. If you dissent after the war starts, you don't support the troops. If you dissent after the first soldier falls, you're desecrating his grave. They have spent millions of dollars to marginalize dissent, and we've got to stand up and say, basta, enough, enough. We dissent. We're the proud Americans. This is our flag, too. This is our flag. Yes. Don't turn your back on the young men and women who died to protect our right to dissent. Don't tell us that we're not proud Americans. And by the way, some of us actually believe in God, believe it or not. God isn't yours. God does not belong to the red states exclusively. Somebody called Tommy Smothers once on the Donahue show, and I said, "Do you believe in God?" He said, "Yeah, but I don't know if he's doing such a good job." Now, by the way, we should watch Fox. You should. If you don't be too good to watch. If you don't watch Fox, you'll be culturally illiterate. You have to know, just watch the Beltway boys. That's all you have to do. Watch the Beltway boys.
I know what's going on.
Fred Barnes. I happened to march in the down 7th Avenue during the Republican Convention. That was a whole bunch of people. That was fabulous. Fred Barnes, 37% of the people in that march thought it was okay for Iraqis to shoot American soldiers. I mean, you have to pay attention. Who was the Speaker of the House for about 6 minutes before I had been an adulterer? Livingston said that John Kerry hates the troops. Hates the troops. You know, and they're getting away with this. And by the way, can you imagine if Bill Clinton had hired a gay guy under assumed name and put him in the press corps who happened to have a website for gay prostitution? Well, now, how about that story? Yeah. The entire nation would have come to a halt for a year. And the righteous Republican brothers from the House would have marched across that rotunda again. And America would have once again been distracted while thousands and thousands of innocent people across the world are looking up at horror as we continue to bomb crowded cities at night where old people and children are sleeping. And we don't have to do this. Oh, we have so much to sell. We have a history of democracy which is beautiful and pure and secure. And America is a place that actually has encoded in law. You don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to salute the flag. If there is any fixed star in the constitutional constellation, wrote Justice Robert Jackson in the Jehovah's Witness case, kids held onto their breeches rather than under the pants rather than salute the flag because their religion disallowed it. Can you imagine being in the 4th grade? Every kid in the class, I pledge allegiance. And the teachers would pull her up. William Robidas was his name, Minersville, Pennsylvania. And I know that teacher was under his breath saying, "Salute this flag, you little bastard." It was a nation at war. This is World War II. This is early 40s. Two decisions. And Justice Robert Jackson came down from the mountain and he said, if there is any fixed star in the constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in religion, nationalism, politics, or any other matters of opinion, nor may he force by word or deed a belief therein. You don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to believe in the United States of America itself. That's how secure we are. Those justices, it was 8-1. Those old guys looked down across that mahogany bench at those Jehovah's Witness children and they said, "You obey your parents." Gives me goosebumps. Makes me proud to be an American. And when I think of that, and I think of all the false piety, and the flags that go across, and the God blessing this and that, and everything in between, you can't run for office without God blessing everything. All the time, throughout the speech, God himself has to wince at all this God blessing. But alas, our times have changed, It's much, much more difficult now with the corporate media. You know, the First Amendment said that, what essentially that means is that anybody can be a journalist, even me. I remember when I first became a news guy, was in Adrian, Michigan, and I used to go to that fire and I'd say, "What did it look like when you got here, Chief?" You know, and he'd say, "It looked like a fire dummy." What do you know? But I could stop. I was probably 21. I must have looked 12. And I could stop the mayor with this little Norelco microphone. The police chief, bang, I could stop him cold. I couldn't get over how much power I had. It was a fabulous, fabulous moment. Awareness for young Phil, who never really appreciated media, what it does. I remember being thrown out of an office because the guy didn't like my questions. I remember the turbulence of covering City Hall and scandals within the police department. It was wonderful. And it was this experience that I brought to the Donahue show. And thank God, we succeeded in a commercial way that allowed us to continue it. Alas, that is not the case today. Today, you have to be a rah-rah media. Today, dissenters are like the dolls in the carny, you know, at the fair that you throw beanbags at, and if you knock them over for the amusement of the people, you get a prize. Well, progressive, dissenting, liberal people, by the way, there are no liberals. They are loony liberals, flaming liberals. No, there's no left, there's a radical left. It is unbelievable how successfully we have been marginalized. It goes on and on and on. They've spent $1 million, the Republican Party, convincing Americans that we're wimps, that we're afraid to go to war. We don't believe in God. They're for life and we're for death. This has been an enormously successful campaign to marginalize those who say, "Wait a minute, I do not agree." But there are some shining examples of people who are true Americans, who will. I can remember meeting these people, even during the time when it was tough to protest the war, for example. And I came to my own feeling that there are 4 phases to commitment. The first phase is the fun phase. I've been through them all. It's the fun phase. Suddenly you're out and you're marching and you're singing, "We shall." Oh man. And I thought, this is what my Catholic faith has taught me. It's not about kneeling down and praying. It's about standing up and doing it. And we bust our kids. And I learned about being patronizing. I realized that after singing "We Shall Overcome," we'd have our meetings. All the white guys did all the talking. And I remember saying, "Well, why don't we get some," we had an activity center. And I remember saying, "Well, why don't we go to Goodwill and get some furniture?" And one of the black guys said, "Hell, we give stuff to Goodwill." And then my wheels started to turn. And I began to realize that I was raised in an all-white church with a white guardian angel that helped me over rickety bridges. The nuns were white, the priests were white, the statues were white. And then Muhammad Ali came on my show. And a woman stood up and she said, "Stop throwing your blackness at me." And he said, "Stop throwing your whiteness at me." How come angel food cake is white and devil food cake is black? Take that white Jesus off the wall. And we had a prophet on the Donahue show. It was the most wonderful people. He just blew them away. Blew them away. Now, after the fun phase, the second stage is the angry stage. Everybody's a bigot but you. Nobody gets it but you. You can't go to lunch with anybody. Just turn everybody off. And then there's a third stage. And that is a sudden, overwhelming awareness of the awesome enormity of the problem. It is the Rock of Gibraltar, and you are the feather. And you're not going to convert the world before you die. Now, this is where I think the saints are made, if I can use the Catholic reference. You either go two ways here. You either go two ways. You have a decision to make. You know that this is huge. You either take guitar lessons, yoga, what do you call those groups when you sit and talk about your spouse? Sensitivity sessions. Or you live under a car top in New Mexico. Or, even knowing, you keep on keeping on. Lean into the wind. You even sing and you dance. And you don't let them allow you to become an old crab face. That by God, this life you have is a fabulous gift. And you're going to laugh. And you're going to dance. And you're going to sing. And you're going to keep on keeping on. There are, and, some of them, I saw Ben Spock that way. With the patrician who had the blue suit. I mean, boy, the handcuffs. He went into that jail cell with the toilet sticking out of the wall. I saw Bill Kunstler that way. He just kept on. I see Gloria Steinem that way. Keep on, keeping on. Leaning into the wind. There are many, many other examples. And there are examples for us today. At a time when literally cable television beat the drums for this war. Literally. Road to Iraq. And the American heartbeat began to. And that if you suggested that we might want to look at why those planes hit the tower, you blamed the victim. You blamed the victim. You couldn't discuss it. Charles Krauthammer just came down and slapped down the great writer who was just passed with the white and dark hair. Susan? Sontag. Sontag, that's right. Susan Sontag. Pardon me, Susan. A brave, brave voice of reason and civility and dissent. There are voices today. And she was one of them. And there are others. We are not alone. And in an age when media has been totally, totally handcuffed by the corporate power that they are so subservient to. Corporate power. Imagine General Electric being thrilled about having an anti-war voice. I mean, these are mutually exclusive ideas. Certainly, they'll put dissenters on, but they're more for the entertainment of the shouting heads and the promotion of the food fight, not unlike the doll at the carnival at which you throw a beanbag. There is no thoughtful dissent, analysis, examination of, for example, civilians killed in Iraq. There is none, except on Pacifica, on many NPR stations, on WBAI, and from the voice and the good heart and the very bright light of Amy Goodman. I don't know how she's doing it. Let us consider this tremendous achievement at a time when the horns of righteous, conservative, bomb the bastards energy is in full roar in America's media. Her program is growing by leaps and bounds. Over 300 outlets. Amy and Juan Gonzalez, let us and Jeremy and David, you shouldn't ever get in a taxi cab, ride on a bus, or take the subway without saying to the person next to you, you know, WBAI is at 99.5. We can do it by ourselves. It's amazing the people out there who want this, who don't know it's there. There is no multi-million-dollar promotional campaign. There are no pictures on the side of the bus. There's nobody flying over Shea Stadium with an airplane trailer. We have to do it ourselves. And what's fabulous is that the people responsible for the merry troublemakers in this firehouse in Chinatown, I had the pleasure of having my first visit there just recently, are young, dedicated people who know what the American spirit is all about, who know what is missing, and who have, without any corporate interference at all, or influence, have built this fabulous, fabulous idea from the ground up at a time when this kind of effort is just so totally small and unimportant and marginalized. They are being heard. They're being heard in the power halls of this nation. They're being heard in the corner offices of some of the largest Fortune 500 companies. They are being heard, and they are scaring the hell out of a lot of people. So let's not let her out there and the merry troublemakers who surround her. Let's not let them out there alone. Let us commit ourselves to ensuring that everybody across this land, and by the way, they are across this land. It's fabulous what they're doing. I was on the show and the transcript was on my computer before I got home. I mean, holy cow. How many personal computers are watching Democracy Now! They have totally exploited the new media in a way that no one else has. They're building their own television stations for $1.50 with friction tape and chicken wire. They are exploiting public service, public access stations. You know, these are the public access. You know, they're the ones with the dim lights, you know. You can hardly see the guy. They're making scores of public access stations. By the way, this is a television signal. Do you have any idea how valuable a television signal follows you into your bathroom? A television signal is the most fabulous vehicle for the distribution of goods and services and ideas in the history of the universe. And we sneered at these public access. Public access stations are being invigorated by Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Becomes the teaser horse. It's the lead horse in the schedule. If you get Democracy Now! On this corner store above the deli television public access station with a studio the size of a phone booth, you draw an audience. Amy Goodman is drawing an audience. And you get to do your own democracy now in your own station, and suddenly things are happening all across this nation, not to mention around the world. Fabulous. Fabulous. So, as one recently separated from my own television show, I'm now running around trying very hard to get in Amy's picture. Smiling. Don't. Now is the time. She and David, Juan, Jeremy, and so many others have done so much to make this. They're a hit. So let's count our blessings here. Let's know who our friends are, and let us count our blessings. They are a hit. And they're going to be a bigger hit. And has there ever been a time when we've got the Democratic Party hiding under their desks? And we've got now spending more than $1 billion a week on a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, while the president is flying in the middle of the night back to Washington because he wants to put the tube back into the body of a woman who's been brain dead for 15 years. Now is the time for us to stand with Amy Goodman and to reclaim the wonderful, wonderful notion, the ideas, the fabulous idea, and the most wonderful experiment in the history of democracy, the one that came down from the sky and put its hand up to stop the wild majority from coming down on those little kids who wouldn't salute the flag. What's wonderful to you? Now's the time for us to take that nation back, to regenerate it, to be the country that the framers wanted us to be. And no one is doing more to recover our nation and its spirit, its true spirit and ideals, than Amy Goodman and Pacifica Radio and WBAI 99.5 on your FM dial. Thank you very much. Go democracy.
I think there are a couple of Pacifica executives in here, and it sounds like Phil is looking for a job. Would anyone here listen to the Phil Donahue show if it was on WBAI? Don, maybe you can sneak backstage. I also want to say, I think it's hard to find a taxi in New York that is not listening to WBAI.
That's right. That's right.
Ever cabbies against books. Well, my co-host here for the evening ran into a little bit of traffic, but he is here, and he began his career in radio when I was 4 years old. And actually, we began our careers together. I was his co-host on the show when I was 4. He began at WBAI in 1980 and has done pretty much every job at the radio station WBAI. I don't think there's much of a need to explain who Bernard White is, but to simply say welcome, Bernard.
Good evening, fellow inmates. Good evening, sister inmates. Good evening to you all. Good evening to those solo travelers who made their way through the elements this evening to get here, to be a part of this activity. Good evening to all of you who have also navigated your way through the mounds of bovine feces that continuously bombard us in the media. And good evening to all of you who are supporters of WBAI and Pacifica. This evening is a very special occasion. I think one of the things we have to remember, when to get this out of the way soon, is that the last time we were together, we had a visit from Farouk Abdul-Muti, who came in. Farouk is no longer with us, and I think, but the spirit of Farouk still lives on in all of us. And I also have to say happy birthday to Amy Goodman's mother, who's a young 75 years old. Happy birthday. This evening is really important, because you know what, one of the responsibilities, we have a responsibility as journalists to try and get the truth to you, and you as listeners have a responsibility to try and get the truth to all the knuckleheads around you who, well, we shouldn't really call them knuckleheads, because they've been bombarded with a steady diet, a steady menu of misinformation and disinformation, to the point when you try and say something other than what they've been getting on Fox and ABC and NBC and CBS, they have a tendency to think that you're crazy, because there's so much information to the contrary. But we're about to move into a period where those young people who were tricked into going into this war in Iraq, who were snuck back into the country in the dead of night and sent to hospitals, those that weren't sent to cemeteries. And they're going to be walking amongst us pretty soon. And we're going to probably see this summer the extent of the damage that this war has caused for the lives of young people all over this country. As we see a proliferation of people who are walking around with less limbs than they were born with, as we see a proliferation of people who will replace those individuals, or at least increase the number of individuals who will be walking the streets homeless. We saw it at the end of Vietnam, and we shall see it again as the country abandons them once they get back here and they've done what the country wanted them to do, which is go on and use their bodies to reap profits for individuals who have no real, you know, it's hard to say in a nice way, or at least in a way, what these people represent. They are the street gangs, they're the crack dealers that have taken over the projects, that are now running society. These people who are on the periphery, who a couple of years ago, everybody knew that they were part of the loony fringe, and that no one paid any attention to them at all. Now they're in charge. Now they have weapons of mass destruction. Now they're lining the pockets of their friends with the lives, with the blood of our young people. And we have to stop it. We have to get information out to people in a manner in which they will hear it, digest it, and be moved to action, because we have to stop it. Rumsfeld, I don't know how many of you saw the front page of the New York Times today, but he's talking about some futuristic military. And we have a responsibility, those of us who listen to BAI and those of us who listen to Democracy Now!, we have a responsibility to get this information out to people so that we can stop these thugs before they destroy the entire planet. We are listening to, you know, the rest of the world is really trying to figure out what is wrong with us. Because the picture that we are seeing of what's going on in the world is totally different than what everybody else is saying. Our news has been so managed that we have gotten a totally different reality. And we're out of sync with the rest of the world. And we're going to pay for that unless there is enough of us who begin to stand up and make it very difficult for these folks to continue through with their plan. We should also be very proud of Democracy Now! Because it is you, it is us, who gave birth to Democracy Now! It grew out of WBAI. It grew out of WBAI, and now it is a stable around the planet. A friend of mine was talking about, he was in the rice fields of Vietnam. And he told folks that, you know, there are some young men that he was from New York, from the United States. And for some strange reason, the only question they wanted to know was, do you know Amy Goodman? They wanted to, because they too are listening to Democracy Now! It is one of the places where people can come and say, well, look, well, there is some sanity in the United States, because there are some people that are trying to give out some other kinds of information, some information that seems to be more in sync with the reality. The exception to the rule is exposing oily politicians, war profiteers, and the media that love them becomes more relevant with each day. We see that it is these oil profiteers and the media, a complicity between the two, that is dragging us into this new year, that is causing our young people to die, to be psychologically deranged, and causing thousands, tens of thousands, the untold story in the United States, tens of thousands of Iraqi men, women, and children to lose their lives and also be married. So I'm hoping that you fulfill your responsibility. Well, the next time we meet, I will check on your itinerary and see exactly what you've been doing, because it is just so important. We have to also let people know that WBAI is there. We do not have an advertising budget. We do... Huh? Thank you. Pay your pledge. Please do honor those pledges. It is extremely important. My responsibility up there also is twofold, to say whatever I got to say. I had a whole speech written, and then Donahue went on so long that this is all that's left of it. And I thought any minute he was going to take the microphone and run up the stairs. But it's wonderful to see him in this setting. I wish he was here a little earlier. We might have gotten a lot more information out to people, since folks seem to gravitate toward those folks who are considered to be celebrities. But he's learning too. You know, this is a constant learning experience, and he's learning too. He entered this pretty naive. He was kind of naive when he entered it. I think he's learned a lot. Hopefully it's not too late. Hopefully he can still get back to the airwaves and begin to continue to share what he's learned with other people. You know, there are so many people that are working in media who it is difficult to respect, because so many people have sold out. So many folks have gone for the money. They have made a decision, a conscious decision, that if I write this, I may not write anything else. But if I write this, if I say that, I will be on TV on a regular basis. I will be working on a regular basis. And they've opted out for the money and comfort. And one of the things I respect about Juan Gonzalez is not that he's poor, but that he has not sold out. That he has, taken the opportunity whenever he could to get to the bottom of information, no matter what other people were saying. When they were down on the site in 9/11, down at the World Trade Center, saying, everything's good, everything's cool, you come on in, don't worry about the air is fresh, don't worry about it, it'll be okay. Juan did an in-depth study of how this air was polluted and how it negatively affected the people, or will negatively affect in a long-term as well as short-term basis the people in that area. But that's not the only thing. He has stood up on many, many occasions. In fact, I don't know how many of you remember that there was something that happened in WBAI. Yeah, the cool time. Well, when something like that happens, everybody is in shock. You're stunned because you don't believe that something like this actually happened. We were in shock and awe that this whole thing took place. And Juan Gonzalez, out of all of that, said, listen, I got an idea of what we can do. Sat down, talked to him, worked out a strategy, and we're back. But this is not new. Juan has a long history of this, and he's been steadfast all this time. So I'm going to move aside, since I've exhausted my speech, and introduce you to Juan Gonzalez.
I'm going to try just to thank you all for coming this evening to celebrate the publication of the paperback version of Amy and David's book, and hopefully that it will give new life to the important information that's in there that more and more Americans need to know about. It's been actually, what is it now, 9 years since we started Democracy Now! I think it'll be the 10th anniversary in January or February of next year. And it has been an extremely important and path-breaking attempt to provide the kind of quality news and information that the American people so desperately need. And I don't get to actually get out much these days. I remarried and had another family and busy trying to deal with that as well as with my job at the Daily News. And I'm really not much of a speaker. I consider myself more a print journalist. I'll always consider myself primarily a print journalist and primarily an organizer. That's what I do best. What I'd like to do for a few minutes is just to talk to you about the state of a profession that I deeply love, and also, since we are in a crowd of the converted, not so much talk about the problems that exist, but what are the real potential solutions that can be affected by conscious and active Americans. I think the critical issue for anyone who's concerned about journalism is really to get at the heart of what's journalism for. It's really to provide the most comprehensive and timely information for the citizenry of any nation so that they can effectively function as citizens. The information should be as comprehensive as possible because we all believe that objective reality exists, but we all understand that everyone's perception of that objective reality is necessarily subjective, and therefore you want to have as many perspectives as possible so that each individual could reach their own conclusions about what that objective reality is. And it has to be timely because history is for historians and news is for journalists. You want to provide the information at the time that it can have the most impact for those people who are receiving it. Unfortunately, American journalism is in a constant and precipitous decline. I never did really have a great golden age, but it's certainly everyone who's associated with it agrees that things have continued to get worse and worse. And I mean, I'm just reminded just in the last few months of some of the examples, the resignation of Laurie Garrett from Newsday, a wonderful, wonderful reporter, and her stunning rebuke of her own profession and what was happening to her, the company that she had been in, the Times Mirror company, the terrible tragedy of the death of Gary Webb, and how he was basically ostracized and hounded to his death by an industry that would not really, could not handle the enormous revelations that he produced in his crack cocaine series some years ago with the San Jose Mercury. The journalist from Sinclair Broadcasting, Washington bureau chief, who resigned after his network tried to tip an election by producing a completely biased report on John Kerry's involvement in the Vietnam War. There's so many of these examples of the individual journalists who are fed up, who've been driven out. Phil Donahue just gave you his war stories of what he tried to do and was unable to do. So there are lots of examples, and we all know the problems of the concentration of media ownership that are driving this, that are behind this, this rapid decline in quality. We're all familiar with the local news, with all of their crime coverage. But we've never really have been done a systematic political economy or an analysis of why this is occurring. Throughout the 1990s, the crime rate in the United States declined rapidly. Yet the amount of time on local television newscasts devoted to crime coverage increased. So if the crime rate is going down, why is coverage of crime going up? It has nothing to do necessarily with crime itself. It has to do that throughout the 1990s, all of these corporate media companies reduced their staffs as they concentrated and merged. They had fewer reporters and yet more news slots, because you have news at 5, news at noon, news at 4:30 in some places, news at 6, news at 10, news at 11. So they had to fill all these news slots with fewer and fewer reporters. The easiest kind of news to report is crime news. Why? Because in every city in America, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of policemen who do nothing else each day except keep records and incident reports on crimes that are occurring. They centralize them all to the police headquarters. You put a reporter in police headquarters, and you have a menu every day, every morning, of the greatest hits, because then the police compile their greatest hits. Not your greatest hits, their greatest hits, for what they think were the most reportable crimes of the previous night throughout the city. So you don't need reporters to be everywhere. You need one reporter in City Hall to get the greatest hits each morning, and then to decide what you're going to cover. When you have few staff, that's the easiest way to do it. So that it's the economics of the development of the industry that is driving the increased crime coverage. Now, there's a side effect that it also reinforces the public's faith and the sense of insecurity that the public has, and the need to rely on the police and the criminal justice industry to protect them. But the driving force of the coverage comes more from the economics of the industry. So that we have a situation where the industry is declining and the concentration of ownership is increasing, but there's another aspect that rarely is considered even by the left in all of this, because unfortunately the left in America is still overwhelmingly white in its composition, and therefore neglects sometimes to look at other aspects of what is occurring. The United States is increasingly becoming a third world nation. It will, in composition, By 2050, the majority of the people living in the United States will trace their origins to Africa, Asia, or Latin America. So you have the reality that the concentration of media ownership is also causing a decrease in the minority ownership of radio, television stations, and newspapers around the country. So we are heading toward an apartheid media system. By the second half of the 21st century, we will have a de facto apartheid media system, in that the media will be, the concentration will lead to almost complete white control of the media, whereas the majority of the population will no longer be white. And if you do not think, because I know that those of my comrades and my compañeros on the left who think that it's not all about identity politics, it's what your political views are. If you think that for a person's ethnic and racial origins has no impact on how the choices that they make and the kinds of coverage, it's just not scientifically factual. The reality is that all studies that have been done, media ownership, show that media companies owned by African Americans, Latinos, or Native Americans, or Asian Americans tend to decide coverage issues in different ways and to provide more community-oriented coverage. Not necessarily the most radical coverage, but certainly the more service-oriented to a community as possible. So I think that the concentration of media ownership is not only affecting quality, it's also affecting drastically the ownership relationships between the different groups of American society in terms of their access to the media. The big problem that we have, though, is obviously, as Bernard mentioned and other people mentioned, is that there's this huge disconnect between how the American people see the world today and how the populations in the rest of the world. I recommend to all of you who have not had a chance to view the Pew Center for the People in the Press. They conduct regular international public opinion surveys, and they just issued another one recently. You go to their website and find it. And it's extraordinary. I mean, the gap between how the American people see what's going on. Do you think the United States is in Iraq to control Iraq's oil? Overwhelming majority of most people in the rest of the world say yes. Right? 18% of the American people think oil is a principal reason. And what is the greatest source of stability or instability in the world of terrorism today? And I'm talking about Brazil, Indonesia, Germany, Morocco, wherever you go, completely different view. That is the greatest indictment of the American media. How is it possible that one population in the world sees things one way, whether it's the environment, the Middle East crisis, the war in Iraq, a range of issues one way, and the rest of the world sees it another? That's the responsibility of the mass media. We've created that in that. And so what I have tried to do over the last 25 years as a journalist is to understand that if we're going to change this, we have to do it in a variety of ways. Number one is we have to organize the workers in the mass communications industry, of which there are by my count, and I'm talking about those who are involved in the creation and dissemination of news, around 250,000 of them. Probably less than 75, 80,000 actually in trade unions, and the rest are unorganized in one way or another. To organize them in any way they can be organized. Whether they're unorganized journalists in one way, those who are organized fight to improve and make more progressive their trade unions. If they're African American or Latino or Asian, help build their own organizations or our own organizations so that they can become more progressive. But basically build organization in the workplace of the media workers of the United States. Two is to build the citizen accountability movement, the public accountability movement toward the media companies, because ultimately it is the people that in one way or another, one who created the American mass media system and who also can hold it accountable. And it's very important to understand because these companies are always talking about, well, it's a free market, let the free market reign. The American people built the media system that exists today. They subsidized it with their dollars in many ways. Those of you who haven't read Paul Starr's recent book, The Creation of the Media, I recommend it. It's an excellent book that looks at the historical development of the mass media. The American postal system subsidized the creation of newspapers up until the mid-19th century. The overwhelming amount of traffic of the postal system was the delivery of newspapers at subsidized rates. So the postal system was one huge subsidy to newspapers because newspapers were delivered. The city daily that's sold on newsstands is a rarity. Most newspapers were delivered into people's homes by the postal system at subsidized rates. The telegraph, the government subsidized the creation of the telegraph, which allowed newspapers to be able to have correspondence in different places and send their messages into one newspaper so that they could produce news in the big cities. The creation of radio. Radio was subsidized by the U.S. Navy during World War I. The technology to develop radio was developed by the Navy. The radio was obviously invented by Marconi, but the technology continued to be developed by the U.S. Navy. And in fact, right after World War I, the government fostered the development of the radio monopoly known as the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, which gave birth to NBC. So the American people subsidized through the postal system the rise of newspapers and the telegraph system. Then they subsidized the rise of radio through government research and development during World War I. Television comes out of radio. Then you have the fantastic development of satellite broadcasting. How many satellites are up in the sky right now that are beaming television signals and radio signals all over the place? Who paid for that? Who paid for all those satellites to get up in the air? The American people through the development of NASA and the ability of rockets to go up in space and to put those satellites up into space. So the American people through the NASA space program developed the satellite system that now broadcasts everywhere. And then of course there's the internet. Again, the federal government provided the initial research grants for the development of the internet through their grants to universities in the early decades when the internet was being developed. Every single form of mass communications that private media companies are using today was subsidized by the American people. And it was only when that technology became profitable, after the experimentation and the government subsidies had been put into it, that suddenly then the companies came along and said, oh, no, let the market rule. This is, let the free market rule. So the American people invested in this complex media system, and they have a right to demand accountability from it to provide the proper information and news. So, there's a third component, the organizing of the workers, the citizen accountability movement, and of course the development of independent, non-commercial media as well. Because all of the other media companies are to one degree or other censored or controlled by the advertisers who basically, if you pay the freight, you decide what rides. So that basically it's essential and critical to continue to have an independent media, and there's always been a battle for independent media in this country, from the development of the Liberator in the 19th century and the development of independent Native American press and Asian press. Because by independent press, I mean both the radical and alternative press as well as the independently owned foreign language, ethnic, and minority press. These independently owned media are critically important to raising issues in a way that cannot be reached by the major corporations in the country. So those to me are the three legs of any holistic, progressive media reform movement. The organizing of the workers within the industry, the organizing of the public to hold the media system accountable, and the development and implementation of independent media, which of course Pacifica was an enormously important component, but there's actually, I've been discovering recently there was an even earlier predecessor to Pacifica. In Chicago, in the early 1920s, as the first radio licenses were being given out, some radical union members who controlled the Chicago Federation of Labor in the 1920s got the first license in 1927 from the Federal Radio Commission for WCFL, which stood for the Chicago Federation of Labor, and they attempted to create a labor radio network back then, but and in many ways were forerunners of Pacifica, but ended up like the rest of the AFL-CIO, not being able to maintain some kinds of progressive. The most progressive positions over the years. So that the big problem that we have in the United States, of course, is, and I think this is the critical thing I'd like to leave you with, is we live in the richest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. As a result, one of the reasons why the American people can so easily accept so much of the misinformation is that it's comfortable for us to do it. The poorest person in the United States, lives in relative luxury compared to many, many people in the rest of the world. One of the problems why sometimes we get so demoralized is because we tend to look at what's happening in the world from the perspective of what's happening here in the United States. I am always optimistic about change and progressive development because I understand that the real changes in the world are not occurring in this country. Right? They are occurring in the countries of the third world that are increasingly becoming more aware and more conscious of their role and their key role in liberating humanity. So that I never get to, no matter how few people agree with me, or how many people disagree with me, but who read my columns in the Daily News, or send me angry emails, or hate mail, or call me up and curse me out, and threaten me, or whatever, I understand that I am living in the most politically backward of all the advanced industrial countries. To be swayed by that backwardness, but to maintain my sense of what is reality in the world today, and that is that the great achievement of humanity to me in the 20th century was not necessarily, some of my comments will disagree with this, was not necessarily the development of Marxism or social revolutions that developed in the early part of the 20th century. The great achievement of the 20th century was that 3/4 of humanity that was living in a colonized, controlled state lifted itself up, created independent nations, and dared to say that we have a role in the world, the modern world today. And that is continuing to happen. It will continue to happen. And eventually the rest of the American people will catch up with what's going on in the rest of the world. Hopefully those of us who are in journalism, either independent or commercial or whatever, will play our role in helping people to understand that. But even if we don't, it will happen anyway. So thank you, and please buy Amy's book and continue to support Pacifica and WBAI.
It's good that Juan's on our side. I keep forgetting to mention, or to welcome rather, the folks that are joining us tonight via the internet, because this is being simulcast right now on the democracynow.org website, video and audio. So welcome to our viewers and listeners around the world, and perhaps in the rice fields of Vietnam, if we believe Bernard. I also want to take a quick minute to thank everyone from the Democracy Now! Staff that made this possible. My colleagues who are producers on the show, Mike Burke, Sharif Abdel-Qadoos, Anu Noguera, Elizabeth Press, John Hamilton, Yoruba Richin. I want to welcome her. She's our newest staff member, newest producer as well. Dennis Moynihan, Karen Nucci, I can't do this as fast as Amy, Danielle Ferris, Jenny Filipazzo, Isis Phillips, Ting Ting Cheng, Mike Castleman, Ryan Abernathy, Mike DiFilippo. I also want to welcome Tammy Coe to our staff. She's a brand new member of our staff. And we have an extraordinary team of volunteers who show up at Democracy Now! Every day of the week and donate their labor to this program. And without all of these people, this program would not be possible. And we are here to celebrate the launch of the paperback edition of David Goodman and Amy Goodman's book, The Exception to the Rulers, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. I felt like we needed to say the entire title of the book for once this evening. And we're going to be hearing from both David and Amy in a moment. I want to just draw your attention to the clipboards that have been making their way around the room. And if you haven't gotten one of these, you may want to proactively seek it out, because you can sign up for our daily email digest, where we send out the transcripts of the show, preview of what's coming up the next day, and then occasional news alerts when there's breaking news, and Democracy Now! Is able to provide coverage, as in the case of Amy Goodman traveling with President Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti as he returned to the Caribbean. So you do want to make sure to sign up for those as well. Our next speaker is someone who a few months ago would not have been able to join us in this room because he was in prison. He was the first U.S. soldier court-martialed for resisting the Iraq War. He was accused of desertion. He was released in mid-February after doing 9 months in prison. Camilo Mejia spent 6 months in combat in Iraq, and he saw civilians killed and detainees abused. And I don't know how many of you heard him this morning on Democracy Now!, but he was talking about a lot of that, and he's very brave to be doing so. Camilo went underground for about 5 months and then ultimately reported and has spent the last 9 months of his life in prison. He is from both Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and as he was saying on the show this morning, his father was considered the singer of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. His father was the man who sang the ballads of the Sandinistas, and went on, also was a diplomat as well. So Camilo grew up for a number of years in that revolution, and it is hard to imagine that that didn't somehow have an impact on the fact that he's here tonight. And we welcome Camilo Mejia.
Many people tell me my stances serve to inspire other soldiers that perhaps having decided to stand up to military authority, to follow my conscience, will open the door for others to follow and do the right thing, whatever the right thing happens to be for them. I made my choice to separate myself from the war in Iraq, in part because I was politically against it, but ultimately because my experience in combat as an infantryman opened my eyes to the evil of every war. And so I made the very difficult choice to put my combat gear down and publicly announce my opposition to all wars, and to voice my opinion that this is an oil-driven war, and that American service members, as well as Iraqi civilians, are paying with their lives. That people like myself and Pablo Paredes, who is in Democracy Now! This morning, who's been charged with unauthorized absence by the Navy, and people like Jeremy Hinsman and Brandon Huey, who have fled to Canada in order to not be a part of this war, are paying with our lives. And the people of Iraq are paying with their lives for this oil-driven corporate war. I was convicted by a special court-martial of desertion. I was sentenced to 12 months of confinement and a bad conduct discharge, still pending. But my real crime to the government and to the corporate world was that I, as an American soldier, came forward with my opposition to the war, that I was critical of the military on a large scale and at the unit level, that I was critical of our government's cruel and unusual foreign policy. My crime was that I, as an American soldier, decided to express my feelings, and that for a magic moment, the international as well as the American media gave voice to those feelings. So I took a jail sentence for what the military calls a crime, the crime of desertion. In my view, I took a jail sentence for performing my duty to the American people and for performing my duty to the world. My duty, if not as a soldier, as a human being. And so as a soldier, I am told, I may well have opened a door for others to follow. I may well have opened a door for others to voice their dissent, or to become conscientious objectors, to give their physical freedom in exchange for their spiritual freedom. Some 2 years ago, perhaps 2.5 years ago, I did not care enough. I was not performing my duty as a human being because I was living in a comfort zone. As a college student, as a Barnes & Noble intellectual, and a suit of Starbucks bohemian. The war in Afghanistan was far away from my apartment, my beautiful apartment, only 2 blocks away from the beach. It wasn't until my National Guard unit was activated that I became aware of what was taking place around me. But around me back then meant in my unit. Around me meant my family and the possibility of not seeing my daughter again. The possibility of dying in a war far, far away. Today, around me means anywhere in the world. And the war is not far away in Iraq or Afghanistan, but deep within me. Even as the war disrupted my comfortable life and affected me in a very personal way, no longer as a civilian living in a bubble, unattached to the suffering of other human beings. Even as the war affected me as an infantry soldier in a combat zone, I still decided to do the easy thing, which for a soldier at war is to push moral principles aside and follow orders, however infamous and criminal. Because there's great fear in the hearts of soldiers at war to disobey a military order. Soldiers can very easily push aside moral values at war to follow commands. We rather take our chances in combat than disobey our leaders, and out of fear we do things against our better judgment, at the risk of losing our lives, and even worse, at the risk of losing our humanity. For a long time I put my humanity on hold to follow orders. My principles pushed to the back of my head, where they would not interfere with the fear of disobeying, or the will to survive at any cost. One thinks humanity can be put on hold until the war is put behind. But the war is never put behind. It stays with us. God knows the war is still with me. Once I came home, I was fortunate to find the spiritual strength to see what we were doing in Iraq. I had the clarity of mind to see the evil of war is not exclusive to the war in Iraq. Given my experience as a soldier, it is my opinion that there is no such thing as a just war. There's clarity in my heart and in my mind that as long as innocent people die in war, there can be no legal, and there can be no moral, and there can be no just war. And that I believe rules out every war. That clarity I owe to my experience, to my family, and to God. And so if my case is to inspire people, then let it be known that this is not simply my case. This is a case much larger than me. It is a case much larger than the case of a soldier in a combat zone who sees the war for what it really is. This is a case much larger than the case of a soldier who sees the face of the war that the mainstream media refuses to show to the American people. This is a case larger than the case of a conscientious objector. This is the case of a regular person, an ordinary person. This is the case of an individual like any other who decided to follow his conscience. I found my conscience, but I also kept my silence for way too long. And if I am to be an example, let me be an example not only of what should be done, but also of what should not be done. Being here tonight is my pleasure and my honor, but it is also my duty to humanity. Freeing and speaking my mind is my moral obligation to America and to the world. Tonight we're here to celebrate the paperback edition of Exception to the Rulers and to celebrate independent media. I want to thank Amy and David and the people at Democracy Now! And the people in independent media for inviting me and for giving a voice to an ordinary person like myself, for going, as Amy says, where the silence is, and for never failing to perform your duty to humanity. Thank you.
You know, being a parent, it is, one of the things that I experienced a couple of weeks ago, and maybe you all did too, those who listen to WBAI, is that we had the privilege of being requested by the Ossie Davis's family to do the funeral. A real privilege. That's something that we all honor. And one of the things that stood out in our minds is when the children got up and began to speak. And everybody who has children, everybody who has grandchildren said, you know, I wish that my kids were like that. That, you know, that they were strong, they stood up, they spoke well, and they were kids that you could be proud of. And Amy Goodman's mom has a lot to be proud of. Because she has two children. I mean, she has more than that, but these two in particular have collaborated long before they came out with a book. I met David during one of the wake-up call programs when he came in with a very loud little girl who, how old is she now? 13. She was about 5 years old, and she came in singing Inku Se Se Kela, the South African national anthem, and which means that there's another troublemaker brewing in the wings. But David Goodman, we don't hear much about David, but he has been working a lot. David is an award-winning investigative journalist. He's a contributing writer for Mother Jones, and his articles have appeared in the Washington Post, The Nation, Outside the numerous other publications, he's the author most recently of the critically acclaimed Fault Lines, Journeys into South Africa. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Vermont. He is the co-author of The Exception to the Rulers, Exposing All the Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. David Goodman.
Thank you. It's great to be here in New York. A year ago, we were at Cooper Union on a similarly miserable weather night, made all the more so by the fact that the place was packed and there were people lining up outside, standing in the rain, who couldn't get in. And at that time, we were launching the hardcover edition of this book. And it really was a launch, in my mind, in the truest sense. It was a launch of faith, because we had no idea where this thing was going. I mean, it was one thing to be in New York. You all know Democracy Now! And Amy and WBAI, and get to hear Democracy Now! At 9 o'clock every morning, and now you get to see it on TV and various venues. But what about that great beyond? I mean, what happened when you got off the last stop on the subway and started to walk out into America? Would anybody even know what you were talking about? I mean, would there be, that response that many of you get when you go to work and you start telling people what you heard on Democracy Now! This morning, and they think that you're nuts? And they sort of start backing up and trying to get back to their office to close the door. I mean, would that be the response out there? Now, I know that Democracy Now! Every day, Amy talks about, at first it was 200 stations, then 250, now we're up to 330 stations.
Wonderful.
I mean, really, you live in New York, and you know this is the center of the universe. I mean, is there really anyone else out there? So we set out to find out on what evolved into, it was over 100 cities by the end. We didn't mean it to be that way, and it has to be said that it was Amy who persevered for the entire length of that. I was coming and going, having a family to dart back and forth to Vermont to remind themselves that I existed. So this tour was a celebration, and it was a celebration of independent media everywhere, of independent bookstores, which are really a threatened species and such an important part of our public space. And we have here tonight an independent bookstore who we're working with. And it was also a celebration of the work that everybody is doing in their communities, and of meeting remarkable people like Camilo Mejia. And I should point out his remarkable family. His aunts and grandmother are here tonight. We just met them. Maybe they could stand up and we could just acknowledge them. So it was both celebration and education. It was, we were going to find out, what was going on out there. And the first stop, we launched it here in New York, and then we went to California. And we decided to do the West Coast launch of it in Fresno. Now, this was very amusing to the journalism elite of California. Fresno is, by their standards, considered to be a backwater. So much so that the LA Times decided to send a reporter to cover the novelty of a book being launched in Fresno. Imagine, it's doing something outside of LA. So we show up in Fresno. There's a hall that seats about 600-700 people. And by the time Amy and I show up, the place is packed. They're lined up out the door, and this became the first of many times that we got to meet the local fire marshal. Now, you know Amy as somebody who gives you the news every morning, but there was another talent that even I, as her brother, didn't know, which was her ability to negotiate with fire marshals every single night and convince them to break the law and allow more people in than the place could hold. So here in Fresno, some 800 or 1,000 people came out to hear what Amy had to say, what we had written about in this book. And the LA Times reporter was shocked. I don't think he knew that there were 1,000 people in Fresno. This began to be repeated every night. Now, we always prepare ourselves for the worst. We are heading to a place, and we are happy if 12 people show up, and anything more than that is gravy. This was particularly the feeling as we headed to Salt Lake City. Now, we're flying into Salt Lake, and I'm thinking, this is going to be bad. I mean, we've been lucky the last few nights. We've gotten good audiences, but, I mean, come on, Utah? I mean, it's the only theocracy in the United States. I think, and once again, we arrive at this venue, a 700-seat hall. It's packed, there's 300 people at the door, and once again, we're greeted by the fire marshals. Amy then negotiates that everybody be let in and they get to sit on the stage. I am telling you this to give you some sense of the kind of vibrancy and fire and hope there is out in the rest of this country that we have seen. The other thing that gives me hope, and also shocked the hell out of us, is that the book has become a bestseller. And various LA Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, all these various bestseller lists, and it became this fall in the election season the top pick of the election season of political books by BookSense, which is the national independent bookstore chain. It's been one of the top-selling books in independent bookstores. It's now in translations in a half-dozen languages and overseas. And I finally want to take the opportunity to thank, this is something we neglected to do in the zaniness of last year's launch, to thank our publishers at Hyperion, who are here tonight, Bill Strawn, Bob Miller, Christine Ragasa, who have worked with us to bring these stories to the world. I would have to say that what we are seeing out there not only gives us hope, it should give you hope. And it speaks of the kind of hunger that there is for real information, real news, the straight story, for unembedded journalism to bring us the stories that we're seeing all around us. I think of what we do in this book and what Democracy Now! Does and what Bernard does on BAI is telling hidden stories. They're simply the stories that you should see and read and hear, but don't. They don't fit the script. They're out of step with the conventional wisdom. It's the world that you see all around you in your communities. You see it everywhere, except in the news. I'll just give you a little vignette of the kind of thing I'm talking about that I experienced just a few days ago. I live in Vermont, as Bernard mentioned. In Vermont, the Iraq War is a local issue. It's a rural state. Half of the Vermont National Guard is now deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. My state has suffered the highest fatality rate per capita of any state in the country. In my community, there are people coming and going from Iraq. We have these little announcements of a party welcoming somebody home. You know people who are coming and going. the Iraq War has affected virtually every community. In the course of my getting on a plane last week, there was a soldier flying back to his base. And also, our plane had to wait at takeoff as F-16s from the Vermont Air National Guard took off and were taking off and landing at the Burlington Airport. And in fact, the sight of fighter jets overhead is a normal sight from my home. That's just what's normal now, seeing F-16 fighter jets flying overhead at the airport, soldiers on planes. It also prompted my state in the last month to vote on resolutions. 50 towns voted to demand that the state legislature recall the Vermont National Guard from something that's happening over there. It's something that's happening to my neighbors. And I was reminded of this again when I got a phone call. It was a guy who had just come back from Iraq. He was a medic. He worked at the local hospital where I had to go to get an x-ray a few weeks ago. He was calling because a doctor had suggested he give me a call, who knew me as I'd been writing a lot about anti-war soldiers like Camilo. And so this guy had just come back, and he called to say that he had been back a week from Iraq, that he and most of his mates from the Vermont Guard unit that were there were opposed to the war, saw it as a religious war, an oil war, and wondered why the media was depicting the soldiers, both locally and nationally, in this sort of one-dimensional kind of caricatures of flag-waving, rah-rah. He also spoke about, as a medic, he said that he was drugging his soldiers, his mates, to go back, to wake up and go into battle every day, that the only way that they could do the job that they were doing was to be doped up. And he was giving out narcotics. This is a guy who's a nurse at the local hospital, a few months before that. And he started to cry as he spoke to me. I was the first person he'd spoke to outside of his family. He said, we're just good people from small towns in Vermont, and suddenly we're in Baghdad killing people. And he said, no one understands what we're going through. And he said, I'm having nightmares every night. I can't go back to work yet. And I asked him about killing civilians. Was that going on? And he said, well, we had a motto. He said, we're going home. That was our motto. That justified everything we did. No matter how hairy it got, we're going home. And I said, what about the checkpoints? What was going on there? And he said, he said, if a car is coming and we don't like the way it's coming too fast. He said, we'll light them up with 1,000 rounds just to make a point. He said, we are going home. And then he started to cry again. Just one story, one phone call, the kind of hidden stories that we're not hearing. So, a couple weeks ago we hear about the Italian journalist, Juliana Segretti, getting shot at the roadblocks. And she's simply traveling in what, when a high-profile person like this is getting shot, you know what's going on. This is simply an entire country that has been turned into a free-fire zone. Occasionally they get the wrong ones who are written about. We write about this in our book in a chapter we have called Killing the Messenger, and this was before Juliana Segretti, but it was already going on. So I'll just share with you a little bit of what we write about in our book, about the journalists, and Jeremy mentioned them earlier, how many are getting killed by U.S. soldiers. In our chapter, Killing the Messenger, we write, the Pentagon was eager to accommodate the 700 reporters embedded with U.S. troops during the invasion of Iraq. After all, these journalists were virtually hostages. They could report only what they could see, and they could see only what U.S. troops allowed them to see. It was the best PR the Pentagon could buy, and buy it they did. From the $250,000 Hollywood set that was built in Doha, Qatar for CENTCOM press briefings, to the untold sums spent to jet celebrity journalists such as Ted Koppel and Geraldo Rivera to and from the front, The Pentagon knew this was an investment in their image that would pay dividends for years. Even combative Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld gushed about the embedded reporters, quote, "We've always believed that we are advantaged as a free country by having the press able to report, to the extent it's humanly possible, what's actually taking place." Lucky, that is, unless you happen to be telling things from a point of view that the U.S. military doesn't agree with. We write about silencing Al Jazeera. Pentagon hawks were understandably pleased with their ability to keep the media under their talons. Their wrath was reserved for the voice that they couldn't dictate to, Al Jazeera. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz said in July 2003, "Our biggest remaining challenges are, number 1, electricity, number 2, jobs and unemployment, and number 3, the domination of the local media by hostile sources, including from the outside world, from Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, and some other unhelpful foreign broadcasts." Hafez al-Marazi, Washington bureau chief of Al Jazeera, felt a chill wind when he heard Wolfowitz. Quote, "When you hear that from someone who's as important in this administration as the information minister was in Iraq, it's really scary." Al-Marazi was later asked at a conference, quote, "Whose side is Al Jazeera on?" He replied, quote, "The sad thing for me is that some of the American networks behaved in similar ways as government-controlled stations in the Arab world before 9/11. They used to call us the Israeli US-backed network. We were suspected of trying to divide the Arab world. The Americans were so positive about us before 9/11, but afterward, when we gave both sides, they behaved the same way that other government-controlled media in the Arab world did to us." Al Jazeera has had good reason to be nervous. It's been the target of repeated attacks by the U.S. military. There was, of course, the murder of its Baghdad correspondent, Tariq Ayyub, while he was on the air, hit by a missile from a U.S. plane. In November 2001, despite the fact that Al Jazeera had given the U.S. military coordinates of its office in Kabul, U.S. warplanes dropped 2 500-pound bombs on their bureau there, destroying it. The U.S. claimed the office was, quote, "a known al-Qaeda facility." In Basra, Iraq, in March 2003, the U.S. dropped 4 bombs on the Sheraton Hotel, where Al Jazeera correspondents, the only ones reporting from the embattled city, were the lone guests. Once again, Al Jazeera had informed the Pentagon of the presence of its reporters in the hotel. And of course, now that we have democracy in Iraq, with the U.S. puppet regime in control there, what was one of their first acts upon taking charge? The U.S.-backed Alawi government was to ban Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya from the airwaves because it was not doing what the U.S.-controlled media was doing, which was simply giving the U.S. government line. So these are some of the stories, the hidden stories, and we also include a few about things that are going on around the streets of our neighborhood. I'll give you an example of a few of those. Protester with sign charged with threatening the president's safety. Brett Bursey, the executive director of the South Carolina Progressive Network, was arrested for holding a sign that read, "No war for oil," outside a venue where President Bush was giving a speech in October 2002. He was charged with threatening the president's safety. Bursey, who was nowhere near the president, said the police told him that he should move to a free speech zone. He refused, saying, "I thought the whole country was a free speech zone." Cop hunts pacifist teacher. Barrie, Vermont police officer John Mott went into Spalding High School at 1:30 a.m. to take photos of the classroom of Tom Treese, a pacifist history professor. The photos, which were not part of any official report, appeared within days on the website of arch-conservative talk show host and admitted drug abuser Rush Limbaugh. Busted for a peace t-shirt. On March 3rd, 2003, a father and son went shopping at a mall outside of Albany, New York. The two had bought t-shirts at the mall and promptly put them on. Stephen Downs' shirt read, "Give peace a chance," and "Peace on Earth." His son Roger had a shirt that read, "Let inspections work," and "No war with Iraq." A mall security guard requested that both men take off the t-shirts. When Stephen Downs refused, the mall called the police. Soon Downs, a retired attorney with the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, was in handcuffs, arrested on trespassing charges. 2 days later, 150 supporters wearing peace t-shirts descended on the mall and forced them to drop the charges against them. And finally, anti-war actor banned. Following actor Danny Glover's public criticism in November 2001 of the use of military tribunals, the Modesto, California City Council attempted to disinvite Glover as the featured speaker for the official celebration of Martin Luther King Day 2002. Glover wondered if King, who called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, would have been invited to his own birthday party if he were still alive. Which all leads us to ask, could it happen here? To answer that, we turn to Chilean author Ariel Dorfman, who narrowly escaped death on September 11, 1973, when a last-minute change kept him from his work at the presidential palace in Santiago, Chile, where he was cultural advisor to Chilean President Salvador Allende. Allende died that day when Chilean troops stormed the palace in a U.S.-backed coup, and Dorfman was forced into exile. On the second anniversary of the September 11th attacks in the United States, Dorfman wrote an essay, Lessons of a Catastrophe, from which this is excerpted. It can't happen here. 30 years ago, that is what we chanted. That is what we sang on the streets of Santiago de Chile. It can't happen here. There can never be a dictatorship in this country, we proclaimed to the winds of history that were about to furiously descend on us. Our democracy is too solid, our armed forces too committed to popular sovereignty, our people too much in love with freedom. But it did happen. The bombing by the Air Force of the presidential palace on September 11, 1973, started a dictatorship that was to last 17 years. And that to this day, even after we recovered democracy, continues to haunt and corrode my country. In the coming years, could something similar befall those nations with apparently stable democracy? Could the erosion of freedom that so many in Chile accepted as necessary find a perverse recurrence in the United States or India or Brazil, in France or Spain or Britain? What has transpired thus far in the 2 years since the disastrous attacks on New York and Washington is far from encouraging. We also thought, we also shouted, we also assured the planet, it cannot happen here. We also thought, on those not-so-remote streets of Santiago, that we could shut our eyes to the terrors that were awaiting us tomorrow. On a slightly different note, I figured I shouldn't leave before doing something that, as Amy's brother, just sharing with you a little bit about what it was like to grow up with Amy. The trouble started early in Goodman households. It began at least back in 7th grade when the home ec teacher called. Appears there was a problem with a sign that hung on the wall of the home ec room that Amy objected to. It said, "If we are not ladies, we are nothing." Amy apparently wanted to be nothing, and this caused a problem. The trouble continued later, and as I learned, you know Amy as this fearless person who never backs down and never, once she gets her teeth into something, doesn't let go. But I know that there is one person in this world who she is very afraid of. I learned that when she called me in 1998 to say that she was going on a trip and wondered what I thought. And she was going to Nigeria. Very nice country, but not a nice place to visit in 1998 when it was ruled by dictators who were cracking heads of journalists who were coming to try and tell the story. Well, Amy and Jeremy wanted to take a little trip there to see what one of our American oil company, Chevron, was up to. And as she began to describe what she was going to do, it became clear that she had the trust of people on the ground who were going to be showing her around. In fact, Ken Saro-Wiwa's family, these murdered Nigerian human rights activists, their family was working with Amy and Jeremy. So as I heard this, I knew that she had to go. And I was also very comforted to know that with Jeremy there, maybe he'd take the first hit when they started swinging those batons. So I said, well, yeah, I guess you should go, but, you know, watch your back and, you know, run like hell if trouble starts. And she said, well, that's great. I'm glad to have your support. And I said, well, when are you leaving? She said, 24 hours. And I said, oh, and she said, listen, I'm really busy and I gotta pack, so could you tell Mom? So on that note, since my mom has just celebrated her 75th birthday, I'd like her to come up and just to introduce you to her, the source of all the trouble. Come on, introduce my sister and the host of the night.
It's a great honor to be with you tonight. Thank you. We don't have much time because I know the Ethical Culture Society has to wrap up tonight, and I know that you, coming out on this night of terrible weather, have to make your way home. But it is a real honor to be here with you, my colleagues, whether we're on this side of the microphone or on that side of the microphone. Together, I was just looking at the quote behind me. The place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. I want to thank the Ethical Culture Society for providing this place tonight. The place where people to meet to seek the highest is holy ground. I think WBAI is holy ground. This is my 20th anniversary at WBAI. I came here in February, March of 1985, and it has been such a privilege to be able to work in a place where I really found at the beginning of my career what journalists look for their whole lives, and that is independence. And that is something we cannot take for granted, and we must preserve for generations to come. When we're fundraising, we often talk about keeping WBAI on the air for a week, for a month, and a year, for someone to discover who comes to New York for college or moves here from another country. And suddenly they find this remarkable place, this university of the airwaves, this place that is open admissions for all, this national treasure, and all the people who've made it so, like Alambe Brath, like Bernard White, like Juan Gonzalez, like Don Rojas, like Alambe Brath and Errol Maitland, all of our colleagues together, and the people who keep it all together, like Grayson and Indra, and all of the folks who Dred Scott Keyes is here as well, and it is so beautiful to see everyone together, and the whole staff of Democracy Now!, Jeremy thanked. We are a family. At times we may get into arguments, at times we may feel the greatest joy together. And what keeps it all together is this tremendous belief that in sharing information, we can go higher, go further, we can change the world. And that is what Pacifica really began more than 55 years ago in Berkeley, California in 1949. A man named Lou Hill and his colleagues said there's got to be a place that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born, and it grew to 5 stations. Our colleagues in KPFK Los Angeles will be visiting in a few days, in Washington, WPFW on Wednesday, KPFT in Houston, the station whose transmitter was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan in its first year of operation, because they understood how dangerous Pacifica is. Dangerous because Pacifica allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, that breaks down bigotry and stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups, that thrive on demonization of whole populations. Camilo Mejia has described on Democracy Now! Seeing abuse in Iraq, not wanting to return to be a part of that. And I really do believe that the torture began long before the first low-level soldier laid a finger on the first Iraqi prisoner. It began here at home, in a country where there are populations who are targeted that we can't hear from. It's always African Americans, but then now it's Arab Americans, Muslims, people of South Asian descent. And when you have an administration that demonizes these whole populations and a media that doesn't give voice to them, instead we hear the same small circle of pundits who know so little about so much explaining the world to us, then it makes it easier for young people to go off when they hear that there are tainted communities of people. It makes it just a little easier to do what this few have done. And unfortunately, we are learning that it is more and more. And it takes some very brave souls like Camilo facing what he did, going to prison to say no. The fact that he wanted to testify before Congress, but instead is the first soldier court-martialed and sent to prison. You have to ask, if we lived in a just society, who would be behind bars and who would be free? When I came over to sit next to Camilo just now, I noticed his shirt. It says Romero. It was just a few days ago, the 25th anniversary of the killing of the Salvadoran bishop, Oscar Romero, March 24th, 1980. He had just given an address that was broadcast all over the country, given the homily at Mass. And this one he directed to the soldiers of his country. And he said, I beg you, I plead with you, I urge you, I order you to put down your arms. He was then assassinated. People in this country, understanding who it was who was involved in his killing, those trained at the Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, started to form a movement here, knowing that what had happened emanated from the most powerful country on earth, and led by Father Roy Bourgeois, who went to the School of the Americas. It has a new name now. He went there with a boombox with the tape of Archbishop Romero's last words, and he made his way on to the base, and he climbed a tree. It was nighttime. The soldiers who were being trained from Latin America were in their barracks, particularly large contingent from El Salvador. And he hit the play button of that boombox. And out came the words of Archbishop Romero. I urge you, I order you, I plead with you, I beg you to put down your arms. Father Roy Bourgeois spent the next year and a half in prison for letting the slain Archbishop speak for himself and speak to his people. The beauty of Pacifica Radio is that it brings us the history and it brings us us the present to inform the future, brings us the voices of W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who was whitelisted from almost every public place in this country, but knew he could be heard on KPFA. James Baldwin debating Malcolm X here in New York on WBAI in the early 1960s. It is so important to keep these airwaves free. I'm only going to speak for a few more minutes, and then when David and I sign books, we'll do it over here. We can talk to you individually. But we've just passed the second anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. There were over 800 protests in this country alone. Tens of thousands of people came out. Camilo and many who were either in Iraq or family members who lost loved ones in Iraq were in Fayetteville, North Carolina, outside Fort Bragg, and they were speaking out. We played some of that on Democracy Now!, and I looked for it in the national news. It was a day of major protest. I did not see on the national newscast, the evening news, one of these protesters interviewed. I'm not talking about Fox. They should be criticized. They should be condemned. I'm talking about the major news networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. They're using our airwaves too. It's not just Pacifica. These are the public airwaves, and we have to take them back. To what we've watched over the last 2 weeks, around-the-clock coverage of the protesters outside Terry Schiavo's hospice. This terribly unfortunate situation. We have the sense the country is divided, and yes, it is an agonizing story. But the country is not divided on this issue, no matter how painful it is. The overwhelming number of people in this country believe that this is a matter to be resolved by the family, consulting with their doctors, and if they have to go to the courts, but against the government, the Congress intervening. You wouldn't know that from the coverage. More than 80% of the people in this country, more than 60% of evangelicals feel this way. And yet, the reason we have a skewed sense of how people feel is the spotlight is on the couple dozen protesters outside that hospice being interviewed around the clock. If only there had been a fraction of that coverage on the second anniversary of the invasion. Imagine if we had known that Mr. Schindler, whose daughter Terry lies in a vegetative state as she has for the last 15 years, actually made a very painful decision years ago, and that was not to use extraordinary means to help his mother. He felt that she should die with dignity. This is Terry's father. You don't get that from the coverage. Or Tom DeLay, the House Majority Leader who's dealing with his own ethics problems, will do anything to divert attention from his own troubles. Did you know that in 1988, Tom DeLay, together with his brothers and his mother, in a similar hospital room, decided that his father, who lay in a coma in a vegetative state after a freak accident, should not be revived by extraordinary means, that they should let him die with dignity. And yet he led the charge, saying, how dare they pull the feeding tube from Terry Schiavo. It is very important that we get information, the facts, from the media, that we get it here in this country, and that we get it in Iraq as well as other countries around the world. That we know the suffering of people in Iraq as well, that we hear their voices. The media did a good job on the tsunami. They raced to the area, Indonesia, particularly Aceh, hardest hit. For December 26th, if you said Aceh, someone would say, God bless you. Almost no one had heard of this stricken place, stricken by 2 tsunamis. The one on December 26th, the natural disaster, and another tsunami, the Indonesian military, that has plagued that province, kept it under a state of siege, and killed many thousands of the Achenese inside. When the media went to that area, we saw the pain of the people of Sri Lanka and Indonesia, of Aceh, of that whole region, and everyone cared. It didn't matter if people were black or white or yellow or red or brown. When we saw their suffering, we cared, and people opened their wallets and their hearts, unprecedented generosity. That is the role of the media, to build the bridges. And yet what they didn't show us at that time, with that intense spotlight, was actually what is happening in Aceh. And even as Indonesia was forced to open that area to the outside world because all the aid groups were there and the international spotlight was focused on them, was the role of the Indonesian military and how it continues today. And that is a story we have to know. It's certainly one I know, having experienced myself the brutality of the Indonesian military in East Timor, a country for the last quarter of a century that was under Indonesian occupation. They killed a third of the population, one of the great genocides of the 20th century, forced out because the people of East Timor never gave up and ultimately voted for their freedom and experienced independence several years ago. But that same Indonesian army is in Aceh right now. And Paul Wolfowitz, soon after the tsunami hit, went to Aceh and came back saying that the U.S. would restore military training to the Indonesian military, which had been cut off in 1999 after Indonesian military burned East Timor to the ground. Paul Wolfowitz, the man who has been named to be the president of the World Bank, who will most preside over development in places like Aceh and Indonesia. And by the way, when people are leaving, definitely stop by the table of the East Timor Action Network that is also outside next to the Independent and the Indie Media Center to get information, because people can do something. They can call their Congress members. They can say, don't restore the military aid, don't restore the military weapons. I want to end with the image of September 11th and what it means and what we can all learn from it. All of us, many of us, I'm sure, were in and around that area right around that time, September 11th, 2001. September 11th, we were broadcasting Democracy Now! We broadcast then at 9. The first plane hit the first tower at 8:47. The second plane hit the second tower at 9:03. We just started the broadcast. We were in the garret of the firehouse at that point, forced out of WBAI. There were no windows in the firehouse in Chinatown of downtown community television, and so we didn't know what was going on outside. We didn't know the first plane had hit, and we were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973. The day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile as the Pinochet forces rose to power. The US-backed, Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed, ITT-backed Pinochet forces rose to power. Thousands of Chileans died over those next 17 years that Pinochet reigned. And then we learned what had happened, and we kept on broadcasting throughout the day, not knowing if anyone could hear the broadcast, but not knowing what else to do as the firehouse was opened and people were coming in who were stumbling away from the rubble. We stayed at the firehouse for the next few days because the military, the police had all moved in. We were within the evacuation zone and they were clearing people out, and we wanted to continue to broadcast. And we saw those pictures go up that we all know so well, the color Xeroxes of the photographs of loved ones lost at the World Trade Center. Thousands of them went up to the fire posts and on the sides of buildings, on the sides of hospitals, on park benches. Pictures of a woman, and it would say next to it, "If you've seen my wife, last seen above the 30th floor of the World Trade Center, please call her husband." Or a picture of a young man holding his child. "If you've seen my son, please call his mother," with that phone number. They were up everywhere. And I thought how familiar these pictures were, similar to those carried on the placards of the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina as they walked the Plaza de Mayo. "Have you seen my grandson? Have you seen my granddaughter?" September 11th united us with people around the world against terror. And when President Bush came to Ground Zero and that chant went up around him, "USA, USA," that was repeated at the Republican National Convention, both on the floor of the convention, and they showed the video of that moment after September 11th, it really sent a chill through me. It's not that I didn't understand the sentiment, but that is not the answer to what happened on September 11th. The answer is a community united against terror around the world. Because September 11th, 2001 was not the first time September 11th related to terror. In Chile, 1973, September 11th, 1977, Steve Biko being beaten to death in the back of a van in South Africa by US-backed apartheid forces died in the early morning hours of September 12th. September 11th, 1990, Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack died at the hands of US-backed Guatemalan security forces. September 11th, 1971 at Attica, the midst of the uprising. 2 days later, on September 13th, then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller called out the New York state troopers, and they opened fire on the prisoners who were protesting prison conditions, and they killed 39 men, they critically wounded 88 others, and they injured hundreds of other people. And they also killed guards on that day. September 11th is not the first time that terror came to US soil. Ask any African American about slavery. Ask any Native American about what's happened in this country. But it is September 11th, 2001, a horrific moment. 3,000 people incinerated in an instant. We will never know actually how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death. And they're the undocumented workers who worked at the World Trade Center. And we should know all their names. We should know all their stories, because that's what dignifies a life. I think of Rita Lazar, who lost her brother Abe Zalmanowitz. Rita, whose son is Matthew Lazar, who wrote the history of Pacifica Radio. President Bush invoked Abe's story in his National Cathedral address after September 11th, and Rita said no. And she wrote a letter to the New York Times that actually got published. And she said even as she knew the worst pain of her life, it would only increase her suffering to know that a woman in Afghanistan would soon lose her brother. She said, not in my name, not in my brother's name. Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son Greg Ernesto Rodriguez above the 100th floor of the World Trade Center. They too wrote a letter that swirled around the internet as they hunkered down with their family, remembering Greg. They wrote a letter to President Bush. And in that letter they said it would only increase their suffering to know that a mother and father in Afghanistan would soon lose their son. They said, not in our name, not in our son's name. And this nationwide movement grew up around the country, not in our name, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. You could see them sometimes on television describing their loved ones that were lost on September 11th. But when they moved from description to prescription, what should happen? Then the media moved to the terrorism experts to tell us what should happen. The Henry Kissingers and the Oliver Norths. Well, maybe they got it right. They are the experts in terrorism. It takes one to know one. I'll just end by saying the only time we could hear their stories was on WBAI, was on Pacifica Radio, was on public access TV, was on community media, independent media around this country. And that is why it's so important that we fight to shore it up, that we challenge the corporate media, and we build up our own media. And that's what WBAI is all about. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across this country, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: life and death, war and peace. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to discuss these issues. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Democracy.
More than just covered dishes and needlepoint. And this was still a very, very sexist society. And feminists were coming on to talk to our audience about women who have children who get too much mother and not enough father. I remember feeling very, very uncomfortable. And it was along this time that I began to realize that I did not expect America to lose a war. And I can remember an Ohio State professor came in who knew a lot about cars and did research. And I said, "What's the best car?" This is 1968 or 9. "What's the best car?" He said, "A Honda Accord." I said, a Honda what? The Japanese were taking over automotive supremacy from Detroit. These are things that never occurred to the child of the 50s who believed that if they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. And all of a sudden, the women's movement was exploding. The cities were erupting. It was our first full year was 1968. The cops beat up the kids in Chicago. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The things were coming right then. I had a television show with my name on it, and we were featuring all kinds of people who were dissenting. And yes, we were having... And we were getting away with it. We had a huge audience. We had women out there who wanted this all the while, and nobody else gave it to them. And yes, we did have sponsors cancel. Bob Evans of Bob Evans Farm Sausage, I'll never forget it for life. I will not sponsor any programs that tear down America. Pretty simple with Bob. I will not sponsor any programs that tear down America. And that was, we had a guy on who said all automobile dealers are crooks, and there went the entire Miami Valley Automobile Dealers Association. Not only off Donahue, but off the whole station. I had salesmen, young guys, 30-something guys whose wives were pregnant, outside my office, and most salesmen at that time were men, by the way, different today. We're slow learners. Wanting to know, what the hell am I doing? You know, and to give a speech to a guy about the First Amendment, to a guy who just lost Rogers Pontiac, rings hollow. And nevertheless, we had a general manager that hung with us. It should be said we had a tremendous audience too. We did have, well, it's amazing what you can get away with as long as you draw a crowd. And we had power. And we had anti-war people on. We had a mother whose daughter, who happened to be a Quaker. We were right near Yellow Springs, a state in Ohio. We had a mother whose daughter.
Tonight to have a number of distinguished guests with us that are going to be sharing some of their reflections of the times in which we live. Among them is a talk show host that some of you may have heard of. His name is Phil Donahue. He stopped in today. We also have a very brave young man by the name of Camilo Mejia. Don't know, Camilo is enjoying his first few weeks in what Phil Berrigan used to call minimum security, i.e. he's no longer in prison. Camilo Mejia served 9 months in prison for refusing to kill or be killed in Iraq. I think that it's very important that we remember those of us that are journalists, media workers, people who are about independent media, to remember how much of a threat independent journalists face around the world today. This was one of the bloodiest years, 2004 was one of the bloodiest years ever for our profession. In Iraq alone, the United States military killed more than a dozen journalists, with a deafening silence on the part of their colleagues from the corporate media. And I think we need to remember that those journalists died so that we could understand something about the nature of this occupation. Their lives were not given in vain. And the way that we honor them is by continuing with their mission. We recently have been following the case of the Italian journalist Giuliana Sabrena, who's a writer for the newspaper Il Manifesto. She was held hostage by an Iraqi resistance group for a month and then was released. And as the car that was taking her to the airport after she was picked up from the abandoned vehicle where she was left by her captors, as that car was going to the airport, it was shot up with hundreds of bullets by a Humvee. And originally what was said about that story is that the Italians refused to slow down at a checkpoint. And so the US soldiers fired in self-defense. Well, now we learn from Juliana Sabrena that in fact there was his more than a quarter of a century on the Donahue show. And I could tell you the story of his being fired by MSNBC for allowing anti-war voices on the air. And I could tell you about the internal memo that said that MSNBC did not want to be the face of the anti-war movement. But I'm going to let Phil Donahue talk to you about that himself. So please join me in welcoming Phil Donahue.
I feel among friends, and it's quite an unusual feeling for me. I was wondering if I'd be recognized, and sure enough, a guy out in the lobby said, "Hey, Merv!" wife and I are children of the 50s. I was raised all Catholic, wall-to-wall Catholic. A girl was a bad thought in my adolescence. And about that time, Marlo makes the point that her parents would say if they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. And that, my folks said, this was the 50s. Eisenhower, America, all good in all things, the good war, Lend-Lease, the Marshall Plan, America. And I, by accident of birth, was a part of this nation. And patriotism was an obvious follow-on to this wonderful nation that did so much to defeat fascism and to put down and respond to the aggression of the Japanese. And so I marched into life very proud and very patriotic. And it wasn't long afterward that I met Noam Chomsky. I said, what are you trying to say? And he looked at me and he said, never, ever trust the state. Now, it's very important to appreciate what an emotional notion this was for all of us who grew up to salute the flag and sing our songs and believe that our country was all good in all things. We were prepared in our childhood.
To a U.S. checkpoint, and that she was not on that road, that dangerous road that everyone was talking about. In fact, she was on a road that dates back to the era of Saddam Hussein, that he had established for safe transport between his palace, which is now occupied by the United States, and the Baghdad airport. It was a road that they had to pass checkpoints of the U.S. soldiers to get onto in the first place. It's a road reserved for foreign embassy officials, U.S. military officials, and U.S. officials who are visiting or working within the country. And we're going to continue to talk about that story on Democracy Now!, but I have one question that I want all of us to think about. We know about the case of Giuliana Segretti because she's Italian, and because Italy's #2 military intelligence official was killed in that attack. He was the #2 man in Italy's intelligence service, and he was killed as he tried to shield her, and he saved her life. And if the United States treats Italy in the way that it's treated Italy, and saying that there was no wrongdoing, it was an accident, and if the United States refuses to hold accountable those who did the killing, if the United States refuses to do an adequate investigation, if they refuse to allow the Italians to investigate the car, which indicates they have something to hide, what does that say about the treatment that ordinary Iraqis receive on a daily basis from the U.S. military? Their deaths go uncounted, their injuries go uncounted, at numerous checkpoints around the country where they did or did not slow down, when they heard someone commanding them to do so in a language not their own and not of the country that they live in at that moment in Iraq. Countless Iraqis have been killed at checkpoints. But the media is too busy reporting on Michael Jackson to talk about any of the more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians who have been killed. There are important issues surrounding the case of Terry Schiavo. But there are important issues surrounding the case of numerous Iraqis who are being killed on a regular basis, and I wish that we had the drumbeat, non-stop, around-the-clock coverage for the tens of thousands of Iraqis who have been killed that they have devoted to this one thing. I also want to do something that this person is probably going to object to, but I can't not do it. I first went to Iraq in 1998 as a young reporter, and I had the pleasure of meeting someone who became I consider him to be my best friend in Iraq. And he just arrived in the United States tonight, and his name is Abdul Sattar Jihad Jabbar. But we are here to celebrate. And we're here to celebrate another anniversary, and that's the 50th anniversary of our first speaker, and that is Phil Donahue. 50 years ago this year, he went on the air as a journalist. And I could tell you the story
for a world that never materialized. I came very late, and I can't be surprised after being raised this way. Ohio State professor came on my program very early on. By the way, we knew we had to be different because we were so visually boring. We had no band, folding chairs. We inherited an audience from the game show, or the host played the piano and you got to wave in the show and you won prizes. That's the show we replaced. So they had the audience, so the audience was there for me when I arrived. We didn't think we needed it. Our first guest was Madeline Murray O'Hare. We knew we had to make noise. And sure enough, in Dayton, Ohio, a local show comes down from Texas, Madeline Murray O'Hare. There's no God, there's no heaven, there's no angels. When you die, you go in the ground, the worms eat you, you biodegrade, and become part of the physical universe. Well, my dear, the roof fell in Dayton, Ohio. No one had ever... You can worship a pet rock if you want to, but you pay for it. I'm tired of paying higher taxes because your churches get all these phony tax breaks. I mean, the woman was sensational. And also very, very unpleasant. But she drew a crowd, and everybody in Dayton knew that there was a talk show on the air that had no band, no desk, no couch, no celebrities. We were in Dayton, Ohio. We couldn't get. I mean, people would say, yes, Dayton, the soapbox derby. And I'd say, no, that's Akron. Don't go to Akron. And we realized early on that we were providing, we had to do a show. We put OGBYN and OBGYN, pardon me. And I'd sit there, the phones would just explode. And I'd be sitting there while women called. The phones were jammed, talking about an itch. And then more phone calls. And then the pill and water retention and blurred vision. The pill, this was 1967. And we suddenly realized we had a program that was speaking to the issues about which women cared that nobody else was. We had to do a program titled Doctors Who Hate Donahue. We talked about patronizing doctors who patted you on the head and said it was in your head and sent you off on a piece of paper with scribble on it that you couldn't read for pills that you didn't know anything about. We were very, very proud at that time of our lives to be kicking some very big tires. And we were drawing a very large crowd because we had accidentally discovered that women, that made up most of our audience, had been reading more sections of the newspaper than their husbands, who cared about more